So today we're starting our new series, which will run for most of this year. A series looking at the three jewels, that's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, in more depth than we might normally do these topics. Which you probably realise from the fact that it's going to run for most of the year, we would quite easily do the three jewels in a single class setting if we just wanted to cover it very superficially. So yeah, we'll be going into it in considerably more depth, but hopefully at a level that everyone can connect with. So we're starting today, right at the beginning, we're starting with the Buddha jewel, and we're starting with the early life of the Buddha. This week and next week, we'll be looking at some aspects of the life of Siddhartha Gautama before he became enlightened, and what we can learn from his experience. For me, I find in many ways this part of the story of Siddhartha Gautama the most challenging of all. Once he became enlightened and he started to teach the Dharma itself, obviously very radical, very challenging. But in a way, because it's being taught by an enlightened being, we can somehow, or I certainly can somehow sort of remove myself from that a little bit, and this is the Buddha speaking. The Buddha's enlightened. Of course he would behave that way. Of course he would say that. Of course he would think that. I'm not enlightened. I can't do that to that extent. So it becomes an aspiration, something that I aim for, but it's not where I am. But when I look at the life of Siddhartha Gautama before his enlightenment, well, it seems to me that I'm looking at someone who was not that dissimilar to me. I'm looking at someone who lived a life, who experienced things, who had difficulties, who's, as we know from the accounts of his early life, he was aware of negative mental states. He was aware of craving in his own experience, and he dealt with those things. In many ways, I find that far more challenging, because if he could deal with them on that level, then what's to stop me dealing with them on that level? So today I'm going to look at particularly at the Buddha's going forth from, or Siddhartha Gautama's going forth, I should say, from the home life and the events that led up to that, and just to see what we can draw from that. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Dharma is a radical teaching. The Dharma is challenging, it's transformative, and that applies equally to the example of the Buddha's life that his enlightenment. Dharma didn't just start when he became Buddha and started teaching. The Dharma is there evident throughout his life, and I think there's much we can learn from the early stages. And this topic of going forth, I think for many of us can be very challenging, because it's setting out an example of perhaps the ideal way to engage in the spiritual life. And it's something that for most of us, I think we find quite difficult to engage in that way. And so it challenges us to question our engagement, and to look at our engagement with following in the path that the Buddha trod. So I'd like us to approach it with that sense of, let's not be too self-critical. Let's not feel that we're being put down. We don't live up necessarily to what we think that example is telling us. And if we do feel some reaction to the example of Siddhartha Gautama's life, then there's value there in questioning that. Why? Why are we feeling that this is challenging us? What is it about our own experience, our own life, that we really need to look at, that we could benefit from looking at? So if we go right back to the beginning, Siddhartha Gautama was born into what has been described by some as a royal family. Probably wasn't a royal family. It's now thought, I think, that his father was a leader, maybe a ruler in some way, but not a king. There was no hereditary monarchy in that part of northeastern India where Siddhartha was born. But his father was certainly a very powerful, influential figure, a political figure, we could say, in modern day terms. He was a very wealthy man, and so he brought his son up with all the trappings of wealth and power and privilege. Young Siddhartha certainly didn't want for anything as he grew up. And we have this account, which in later life, as the Buddha, he gave when he was in conversation with a young Brahmin, and he's speaking of his early life, reflecting on his early life, and he mentions that he had a specific mansion for the summer season. The summer season in India is extremely hot in the plains, and Siddhartha Gautama is probably also would retire to their mansion for the summer, which would be further up in the Himalayan foothills, where it would be cooler and more pleasant. And here we get a sense of the luxury that surrounded Siddhartha as he was growing up. And he points out that in this mansion that he retired to for the summer season, there were only women there. There were no other men. It was him. He was surrounded by women. From the beginning of this period, he says he didn't come down from that palace. He stayed there. And later on, if to visit a park, which seems like a lovely thing to do, that he would be, you'd have an escort of the best horsemen that were in the employment of his family, and he would be escorted front and rear. He was a celebrity. It brings to mind for me the image of the Queen travelling in the state coach from Buckingham Palace to the Houses of Parliament. And she goes to open Parliament. The pomp and the ceremony. That Siddhartha couldn't even sort of just pop out to the park for a walk around the park without being surrounded by his entourage, attendants following him and waiting on him. And as he said, this was the power that he had. This was the wealth and the status, the position that he lived in. And he described his upbringing as being superbly delicate. So we get a sense of this young man, the kind of life that he was living. A life that even to us in our affluent society might seem extravagant in the extreme, and certainly much more so in the society of India 2,500 years ago. He would have been among the elite, the very peak of society. And one would think that perhaps that would be a very rewarding, a very pleasurable, a very satisfying way to live. Who would not enjoy living like that? And no doubt for quite some time, young Siddhartha did enjoy living like that. But it wasn't entirely good for him. Although his material surroundings were the best they could possibly be, he still had a somewhat troubled mind, and he reflected on the nature of his situation. Now, he may have reflected on this for much of his life. It may have come to him as he was growing up, as he became an adult. I'm not quite sure, but he does talk about reflecting on the circumstances of his life. And again, from the same sutta, we have this depiction of his reflections. This is quite a sort of a bare, stripped down description. He simply says to the person he's in conversation with that he thought to himself, I'm subject to disease, old age, and death, and not exempt from them. And he obviously recognized that he found that difficult. He said, he found it disgusting and humiliating that he should be. He didn't like to see other people who are sick, old, or dead. It kind of impinged on his sort of calm, tranquil, beautiful world to have to recognize that there were these aspects of life which weren't so pleasant. But noticing that reaction in himself to those, he realized, well, actually, that's not really proper. It's not as though I'm exempt from all of this, that it's not going to happen to me. So I can kind of push away other people who are sick, who are getting old. Well, I can ignore the fact that people die. But I'm subject to that as well. It applies to me just as much as it does to anyone else. So why do I feel disgusted or humiliated by it? And I guess the immediate question that arises for us from this is, what is our response to this, the reality of the situation that, that we will get sick, we will grow old, we will die. It's not as though there's any option here. It's not as though we have a choice. If Siddhartha, living the life that he lived at the top of his society with all the wealth and power that he had at his disposal, still had to acknowledge that he would get sick, he would grow old, and he would eventually die. And everyone else around him was the same. That would happen to everyone. And I guess in his time, just as nowadays, people didn't like engaging with those negative aspects of the reality of their existence. The people tended to push it away. There are numerous accounts throughout the Pali Canon of people who lose someone close to them, can lose a child or a husband or a parent, a brother, a friend, and they have difficulty accepting it. And they ask the question why in their distress. And the Buddha answers this over and over again, that this is the reality of life. It's not that we're being asked to be fatalistic about it. It's not that we're asked to just sort of sit in our chairs in a darkened corner and wait to die. But on the other hand, the Buddha is asking us to be realistic about what life entails. And I guess one can't help but reflect on the events of the past year in these terms. How initially, and perhaps even still, particularly in the developed world, in the affluent first world, as it were, there is almost a sense of disbelief that we can still be subject or at the mercy of something as simple as a virus that spreads around the world. The question is why? Who let this happen? Who's to blame? Why did this happen? So for some reason it shouldn't have happened. But of course, if we know anything about history, we know that this is not a unique event in human experience. Sickness, pandemics have afflicted humanity for as long as we have recorded history, and certainly long before that as well. Most recently, of course, we had the Spanish flu about 100 years ago, which in fact was far more severe than the current COVID pandemic. So it's not unusual, and it's not to be unexpected. It's almost as though we feel that we have a right not to get sick. Why should sickness affect me? Surely something can be done about it. Maybe the health service isn't good enough. Maybe the doctors aren't good enough. Maybe the government's not putting enough money into it, or whatever. It's almost as though we have a right not to get sick. We resist growing old. It's such a common feature, particularly again of the more developed, perhaps more developed societies. The huge amounts of money that get spent on masking the changes that age make to us through cosmetics. And I hasten to add cosmetics for men as much as cosmetics for women. this is not a gender thing at all. Although men might like to think they're not subject to it, we are. I wonder how many bathroom cabinets